Simon Shinerock, you've been given the title of the UK's most opinionated estate agent. What's your opinion on regulation in estate agency? Talk to me.
Okay, Chris. Well, first of all, I think it's important for me to tell you a little bit about my background. So, I went into financial services pre-regulation at the age of 24, and I went on to become a branch manager, recruit and train what were called life insurance salesmen. Now they're called financial advisors. So I saw how regulation changed that industry for the worse. Basically, it disenfranchised about 80 plus, probably 90% of the population from receiving any form of advice. And the reason for that is because the number of advisors went down following regulation from about 200,000 to probably more like 20,000. And the easiest way I can actually explain it is that regulating financial advisors would be a bit like regulating car salesmen, but not regulating the car. Huh?
Right.
Yes. Well, I mean, you can regulate what a car salesman says and how he prospects and everything he does, but if the wheels fall off the car, then it's no good, is it?
True.
So some of the products that are available, the collective investment products, very poor value, very cumbersome. They say they've got rid of commission, they haven't. There's a brewing pension scandal that's happening now. So all of the old problems still exist. But what actually has happened is there's less consumer choice. Huh? There's less consumer choice. And the easiest way, and this is the most important thing here, sorry Chris, but it's the most important thing here, is that the easiest way to protect consumers is to educate the consumers, and preferably at school. So for a long time, I've been an advocate of teaching relationship building, communication skills, financial planning as part and parcel of education, and that would apply to property transactions too. It's hard to con somebody if they're educated.
You've been through the paper that the government have published. For those people that don't have that sort of patience, because let's be honest, most people haven't, paraphrase what it says.
It says we want to copy the financial services regulation and do something similar for the estate agency market, both lettings and sales. The problem is that in reading it, it's so obvious that the people that have written it have little or no empathy or understanding of what they're actually writing about and trying to regulate. It's also obvious to me that because of the complexity, it's a huge complexity. When you actually boil it down, it's all very simple. You want to let a property, I want to rent it to you. You want to sell a property, I want to buy a property. It all sounds very simple. But when you start to break it down into its component parts, it becomes very difficult. And so, for example, if you've got a customer services centre in a property management business and you've got young people operating on the phones and doing a job, they come in, they get some training, they get on the phones, they do the job, and you impose your standards in your business. But immediately you have this one thing which says, oh yes, well this person's got to be qualified to do that job. Yes, they can do it when they're not qualified, but they've got to be supervised very closely by a fully qualified individual. Now, once you work out how much does that cost a business then?
Okay, but surely, there's a lot of sharks out there in estate agency, and you hear some horror stories. Do you think that those horror stories are as big as they are, or do you think it's just there's a very few effect, and the most people are pretty good in the industry?
So no one's perfect. No industry can ever be perfect. But you have to apply your resources to the biggest problems. So, for example, in lettings, the biggest problems exist in the DIY sector. This is the 50% plus of private landlords who don't use an agent for anything, and the vast majority.
Should they be regulated? Does this regulation cover those?
Well, it's very interesting because it was specifically they were excluded from the scope of this paper, but the paper intimates that actually, quite rightly, if you're going to regulate the agents, then if most of the problems exist because of the private landlords and you don't actually regulate them, and then you force a lot of agents out of business, and then there's a more expensive offering, and then more people go DIY, which is, by the way, the biggest risk of all. So what you do is you regulate a business, and just like in financial services, you put the cost of doing it up, less people do it, and then more people go DIY, and you actually lower the quality of the service.
But won't it improve the service if we're having qualified people doing a good job?
If you impose the kind of regulation that had some sort of insight and common sense, for example, if as a principal of an estate agent, you had to go through the equivalent of a driving test, yeah, that showed you were competent and you understood the rules of the road, that would make some sense. And actually, you don't make people do continuous driving tests, do you?
No.
You rely on the fact they can carry on driving. Well, it's exactly the same in a estate agency. So if you had a qualification that an estate agent would need to achieve in order to be a principal, and then he became responsible for his business, and if he wanted someone to run it, not him or her, then they would actually have to have a qualification also, and that you would give some incentives, for example, for more junior staff to take that qualification. And if that qualification was down to earth, practical, had insight into the business, that'd be great. But it won't happen that way, Chris.
So do you think it will have a greater impact on lettings or sales?
Well, I think it'll have a greater impact on lettings. And that's because there's many component parts of lettings. And if you start having different qualifications for all those different component parts, that's going to introduce a vast amount of complexity. And it's going to make it very hard for people to go from one role to the other.
Yet surely if we've got better qualified staff, we'll be able to charge more and do a better job for our landlords.
I don't think that's right, though. I think in practice what's happened, again, I've seen what's happened with regulation.
Because people are still going to need to let their houses, and let's be frank, most landlords use a letting agent because they can't be bothered with the hassle.
As I said, 50% of landlords don't use a letting agent.
But they never will
anything.
they?
No, but of the 50% that currently do, if the price goes up, and the selection goes down. And also, it's not just that, because this is a domino effect. Because one of the things, again, that happened in financial services is the domino effect was that you couldn't market it anymore. Why? You could never get an advert that was compliant. And it was, so they became the anti-business police. And everyone was too scared to do anything. And even if you read what's going on now, you can already see it building up and building up and building up.
I mean, we've almost got to have, like, your home is at risk adverts.
Worse than that, be far worse than that. I mean, already without full regulation, I read recently someone saying, if you take on an instruction that's ever been marketed by another agent, you're going to have to do like hours of work to figure out who viewed it and who did this and who did that. And even then you might not get your commission, and you've got to go through this process. Well, what happens in financial services now, because my brother-in-law, who worked for me for 16 years, trained him from scratch, still in the industry, and he is absolutely hamstrung, with paperwork. Now his role, his job, and also his talent is with people and communication. It's not as an administrator. So now he has to employ, because he's a good producer, 2 administrators just to back him up.
Okay, but if there's going to be people on the edges of lettings that are going to be bailing out, that means the good agents who do get qualified will have more landlords. And yes, you'll have some dropping off.
I have no idea what's coming at them. When I was with the Imperial Life of Canada, who'd been going for 100 years, I was their top manager, and the whole company they're pro-licensing. In fact, they even brought out their own license in anticipation of. And they were jubilant when it was announced that there was going to be initially the financial planning certificate. And Loutro was the first body that actually was in charge of that of the industry. They were about the first or second business to go down. They were effectively put out of business.
Okay, so
by the regulations that they wanted.
How do you think it will affect a state agency?
Well, it depends how it's done. But if it's done the way it looks in that report and it's not amended, I think that it will drive this trend towards do-it-yourself sales and do-it-yourself lettings. So
what can we as an industry do to try and affect the regulation and how it affects our industry?
Well,
that's Arla's job in our ANEAs, isn't it?
Yes, but unfortunately they are completely blinkered in their desire to have regulation. So for them, it's almost an impossibility to go in there and say, actually, this is what should happen. And of course, you've got RICS who will probably be given dispensation because they're already fully professionally qualified and have to meet a lot of these hurdles anyway.
But you don't see RICS surveyors complaining that they're regulated.
That's right, but there's just a tiny number of them by comparison. And yes, it's true that if you're the sort of person who's going to become a RICS valuer and actually run that kind of a business, but then again, you look at every market leader in the high street, how many of them are actually RICS agents?
True. So is there anything we can do as an industry to try and steer this in the right direction where we can mitigate any issues?
Well, it's interesting, we've got an MP who's actually,
Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah.
Right.
I would imagine he understands how a state agency works, and he must have the ear of a government. I also think that Boris is a much more open-minded individual. I mean, everyone says he's very mercurial, but I think he's much more down to earth when it comes to things like this. And I think if somebody were to sit down with him and explain the mechanics and the complexities and the challenges, I think we might get somewhere.
Well, let's see how we get on. Thank you very much.